Hello, and here we are for a discussion of international marketing. And we're going to take a very broad uh, perspective on international marketing, and we're just going to say that involves when a company markets a product in multiple countries. Um, that may sound really, kind of trite, but uh, there's actually distinctions out there between global marketing and international marketing and multinational marketing, and we're just going to take a really broad perspective. We're not going to get into the nuances of what the difference between international marketing, global marketing, and multinational marketing might be. So again, we're just talking about a company markets a product in multiple countries. So Coca-Cola, for example, does international marketing because its products are sold in many different countries. Um, Toyota sells its automobiles in a number of different countries. So those would be examples of international marketing. And um, this is an interesting topic right now because of a lot of stuff that's going on in the real world. I alluded to some of the stuff back in the introductory lecture or the overview lecture, and Mr. Trump our president of the United States, has decided to impose a number of tariffs on a variety of products as well as a variety of countries and economic trading blocks. And so the concept of international business slash international marketing slash international trade is really interesting and for many people very troubling at the present time. So I usually say, when I've taught this in the past, I usually say, well, international trade is here to stay and it's not going away and it's supposed to grow at a particular, 2 to 3% or whatever. I'm not really going to say those kinds of things now because we're in somewhat uncharted territories. It's now early July. Some of the tariffs that were uh, proposed have been implemented, and not surprisingly, the countries or the areas of the world that have had tariffs imposed on them have decided to reciprocate with tariffs against U.S. made products, and so we live in interesting times. Let's just say that. So what we're going to do is in this particular topic, rather than me wax philosophical about the world, is we're going to look at two primary topics. The first is we're going to look at international marketing from the perspective of the macro environmental components that we talked about in the overview lecture. So we're going to use the PEST framework. And the second thing we're going to do is we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about international marketing in terms of the 4 Ps of the marketing mix. All right. So again, the first thing we're going to talk about is the macro environmental components. Again, the PEST framework and political is the P, and so one of the reasons that we live in really interesting times is that the United States, as well as some other countries, are having real political battles in terms of what their country's kind of philosophy towards other countries is, and because of that, that's going to have an impact on countries and their willingness and or ability to trade with each other. So, historically, what had happened, in what we had seen a number of instances of, is what we will call multi-country trade alliances. One of the most prominent is, for those of us who are in the United States, is NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which involves the U.S., Mexico, and Canada. And one of the things that agreement did was it reduced a lot of the trade barriers, both from a tariff or a taxing perspective, as well as documentation requirements. Documentation requirements Being a logistics guy, there's a lot of documentation requirements associated with products moving from one country to another. And if you reduce, if you reduce the taxes on a product and you reduce the documentation requirements on a shipment, an effect of lowering the overall cost of the product. And when you lower the overall cost, that means from a marketing perspective, price can be impacted. So one of the things that's happening is that, for example, and again, I'm not trying to pick on President Trump, but he's basically indicated that that he's going to start taxing things that come into this country, and other countries or other trading blocs have decided that they're going to tax U.S. made products that come into their countries, and one of the products is Harley Davidson's, the motorcycles, and so what Harley Davidson has suggested in the last 10 days is that it's going to move some of its production into the European Union in order to avoid some of the tariffs that are being imposed or that are going to be imposed on U.S. made products coming into the European Union. So these trade alliances that have been long-standing, right? The European Union's been around for a number of years, and NAFTA has been around since the mid 1990s. There's the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership, or the TPP, or the Trans-Pacific Partnership that the U.S. was supposed to be a part of, but has since pulled out of. These things have been out there to lower tariffs, taxes, right, and also to reduce documentation requirements. So, one of kind of the basics of international trade is that you reduce or you facilitate international trade by reducing trade barriers, and so things that hinder trade, such as tariffs or non-tariff kinds of things, embargoes, quotas, things of that nature. They're not necessarily good for facilitating international trade. So we look at the political, right, and we're talking about each one of these macro environmental factors independently, but they have an impact, right? They interact with each other. So, for example, and we talk about political, but when you start talking about something like a tariff, a tariff has economic implications, right? Even though the kind of the rationale behind a tariff is political in nature. So if we talk about political, the next we're going to talk about is economic, the E in the PES framework. And we had mentioned before in the overview lecture, we had talked about GDP, right, gross domestic product, and the value or the amount of goods and services produced in an economy in a particular period of time. And as I mentioned there, one of the interesting aspects of GDP is not just total GDP, right, but GDP per capita, right? You take the gross domestic product for a country and then divide it by the number of people in the country. And so, if I were to ask you, right, according to the CIA World Factbook, and that's a valuable, if I don't know how many of you might have used that as some sort of a reference point, but the CIA World Factbook is like a treasure trove of secondary data collected largely by the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, and it has a lot of data about pretty much every country on the face of the earth. And one of the things that the CIA World Factbook reports is economic metrics, to include gross domestic product for a country, but also gross domestic product per capita. So if I were to ask you, right, what country has the highest gross domestic product per capita, outside of a fun fact to know and tell, right, it turns out that it's Liechtenstein, right, very small European country, and about 140,000 US dollars per capita. That's important because at the other end of the spectrum, are countries that have very little or very small gross domestic product per capita. Those oftentimes are referred to, or what are known as bottom of the pyramid, BOP, not or base of the pyramid, right? And not necessarily balance of payments, which is another multinational trade concept. But BOP, or the base of the pyramid, or bottom of the pyramid, refers to people who have very little in the way of income. There is not total agreement on how you define bottom or base of the pyramid. Some people say that it's people are living on $2 a day. Some people say that they're living on $4 a day. Either way, these are people that don't have a lot of money. And one of the reasons I like to bring up the BOP is that when we talk about the 4 Ps in the second part of this discussion, I'm going to use kind of bottom of the pyramid as an illustration of the 4 Ps of marketing. And one of the things that's happened over the last 20, 25 years is that there's been a growing recognition that even though individuals who are in the bottom of the pyramid are not necessarily an attractive market, there are a lot of people overall, right, roughly between 2 and 3 billion people in the world are classified as being at the bottom of the pyramid. And so in the aggregate, that group has tremendous purchasing power. And so there's been a lot more attention put on the kind of the bottom of the pyramid. And again, when we talk about the 4 Ps at the end, we'll give an example of how that plays out in terms of the 4 Ps. The S refers to social, as we mentioned before in the overview thing. And one of the things that we'll look at in social is a concept known as the self-reference criteria, or the SRC. And the SRC, or self-reference criterion, refers to the unconscious reference to experiences, culture, knowledge, and using them as a basis for decision making, right? So, and we all have self-reference criteria, right? We all exhibit self-reference criteria, which refers to the unconscious reference to experiences, culture, knowledge, and using them as a basis for decision making. And so, a lot of different examples, but the self-reference criteria is one of these things where if a country or a company doesn't check its self-reference criterion at the door, it can end up making a lot of really suboptimal decisions from an international business or an international marketing perspective. So for example, to give you an example, a number of years ago, 2004, I taught at Peking University, in Beijing. And I was teaching a marketing research course. I was there for about 6 weeks, from roughly mid-November to right before Christmas. And every morning I would go next door to where my hotel was. There was actually a hotel on campus. Actually, there were multiple hotels on campus. It was not a dorm, it was a hotel. And I would go next door for breakfast. And first of all, one of the things is that hey, we're not in Kansas anymore. The old Wizard of Oz line, right? Yo, Dorothy, we're not in Kansas anymore. Is when you start seeing what people are eating for breakfast, you're not seeing a lot of eggs and bacon and stuff like that, right? And in fact, one of the offerings was there were multiple soup offerings. And that wasn't a really that's one thing, from a self-reference criteria is like, hey, where's the Kellogg's? Where's the Frosted Flakes? Where's the Honey Nut Cheerios? But inevitably, I'd be sitting there and I'd be eating my breakfast. I would have rice and vegetables and fruit and stuff like that, right? I didn't have soup, right? Didn't tend to have soup for breakfast. But there'd be all these people just going with their soup, right? And you're sitting here and you're going, oh my God, these people don't know what they're doing. Absolutely not. Because, right, and this is the self-reference criteria, right? Because, like I was raised, if I ever did that at the dinner table, my mom would have smacked me halfway into the middle of next month, right? But in many cultures, right, slurping soup signifies that you are enjoying the meal, and it's actually a positive thing and not a negative thing. My only point being that, a number of companies and a number of US companies, when they've gone and done business in other countries, they have been susceptible on some occasions to the self-reference criteria, because they just assume that the way that things are in the United States are the way that things are going to be in other countries. And that isn't the case at all, right? And so, there are so many examples. I mean, I spent some time in India in 1995, and 85% of people who live in India are Hindus, and the cow is a sacred creature, and basically means they're not eating beef. You might find it hard to believe that there's a whole population that doesn't eat beef. But on the other hand, there's populations that don't eat pork, and there are populations that don't do a bunch of other things, right? So the self-reference criteria is something that can get people into a whole lot of not so wonderful decisions from a multinational marketing perspective. And then the final component of the PEST framework is T, which is technology. And I'm just going to spend a really brief amount of time on it. But one thing, there's something called the Internet Usage World Statistics website. Yeah, God only knows these things are out there. And if you get a chance, you might want to go there and look, because one of the things that it does is it breaks down internet usage by geographic regions, by individual countries, and things of that nature. And so, for example, if you come out of the West, if you come out of the United States, you probably are thinking that, everybody in the world is connected to the internet. That isn't true, right? And so, for example, Africa as a whole, approximately 30% of the African population uses the internet. In North America, that percentage is much closer to 90%. So part of it is, part of this again is, again, and here's where the self-reference criteria stuff would come in, right? You just sit there and say, well, everybody has a computer, everybody has a smartphone, everybody, no, right? I mean, there was a statistic, and I don't know how valid it is, but there was a statistic like 5 years ago that half the world's population had never made a phone call, right? Think about that. All right, so we've talked about PEST from a multinational marketing or international marketing framework and or perspective. And we'll conclude this discussion of international marketing by looking at the 4 Ps, and looking at the 4 Ps in terms of a bottom of the pyramid perspective. And so part of how I'm going to illustrate this is in 2009, I traveled to Nicaragua as part of an immersion trip with a couple of John Carroll staff people and a number of John Carroll undergraduate students. And we went to Nicaragua, and part of it was to basically to learn about fair trade in Nicaragua. It was a fascinating trip for me. And I had firsthand experience with the bottom of the pyramid kind of thing, because we stayed in individual houses. We stayed with families, host families in Managua, which is the capital of Nicaragua. And one of the Sunday nights we were there, we went from the host family that I was living with, and we went a couple of houses down to another family, and we were just kind of sitting around. And this family was running a convenience store. Literally, was running a convenience store out of its living room. And you say, well, that's really fascinating, but I don't care. And you say, well, why were they doing that? Well, one thing is it gives them money, but this is one of the things that you'll see sometimes in bottom of the pyramid is you will see very different type of retailing, right, than you would be used to in maybe a more developed or an economy that had a higher gross domestic product per capita. And so the people whose house we were visiting, they had a selection of products. They didn't have a lot of products, and interestingly enough, right, some of the products they were selling were products that you could buy in a grocery store, let's say in the United States, but they were sold in units of one. So, and I pardon the example, but hey, it's an example, right? I'm sitting there, and this young lady walked up, and she bought one tampon, uno, on, right? And you might sit there and say, why did she do that? It was because it was all she could afford. Okay, so she couldn't buy a box, but she could buy one. And so one of the things that has emerged, right? One of the things that has emerged for marketers from an understanding of the bottom of the pyramid from a 4P perspective is that because you're dealing with the bottom of the pyramid, right? These people don't have much income. Price is an extremely important variable, right? Duh. In addition, marketers are understanding that just because people are poor, it doesn't mean they don't have needs and wants. And so, what marketers are striving or struggling to do is they're struggling to learn how they can satisfy these needs and wants at a price point where people can afford the product. So, what you will see in many cases in bottom of the pyramid situations is you will see single use servings, what they call, in some countries, they call them sachets, SACHET, right? So instead of having a lot of shampoo, you got a single serve of shampoo, right? So we have both product and price considerations. Distribution becomes much different because now what you're dealing with is a lot of like smaller outlets in many cases. Sometimes, like I said, the living room of somebody's house in a neighborhood, right? And so instead of having these, huge tractor trailers, showing up at a Walmart, packed front to back, floor to ceiling with product, you might have somebody showing up on a bicycle that has a little tote that has a bunch of different products in it. So you've got a difference from a place perspective, and then from a promotion perspective, right? You're probably not, if you start thinking about it, you're dealing with bottom of the pyramid kind of stuff. You may be in a situation where, again, people don't have a lot of money. You're not going to necessarily be doing a lot of stuff from a social media perspective. There might be a lot of word of mouth going on. There might be a lot of billboard kinds of things going on. So, but again, right, even though an individual person in the bottom of the pyramid might not have much income, right, you know, 2.5 to 3 billion people combined, that becomes a pretty substantive market. So what we've done is we've talked about international marketing. We've defined it. When we've talked about macro environmental stuff, and we've concluded with a brief discussion of the 4Ps. See ya. Bye.